The hammer rang against the anvil at dawn, the way it always did, the way Ezekiel Prescott had made it ring every morning since he was old enough to grip the handle without his father's hand wrapped around his own. The forge burned gold and copper in the early light, and the smell of hot iron and char drifted out across the plateau where the windmills turned in slow, dignified circles against a pale sky. It was a good morning, the kind that made a man feel like the world was still manageable, still honest. Then the rider came screaming up the hill road at a gallop, and the morning stopped being good. Prescott. The rider was Henley, the miller's youngest son, and he had the look of a man who had run from something and hadn't decided yet whether he'd gotten far enough. He hauled his horse to a stop outside the forge, nearly pitching himself over the animal's neck. Prescott, there's an Orc war band on the plateau road. 7 of them. They've got the alderman's grain wagon stopped at the fork. Ezekiel set his hammer down on the anvil edge with deliberate calm. He was 31 years old, broad across the shoulders in the way that comes from 20 years of honest work rather than any particular gift, with soot-dark arms and a jaw that hadn't been shaved in 4 days. He was not a soldier. He was not a hero. He was the only blacksmith on the Gorehorn Plateau, which was a name that most people in the valley villages thought was a coincidence, and most of the Orc clans knew was not. "Are they armed for a raid or for a trade?" he asked. Henley blinked. "What does that matter?" "It matters," Ezekiel said, pulling on his leather apron and walking to the water barrel to cool his hands. "Because if they wanted to raid, they wouldn't have stopped the wagon at the fork where 3 roads meet and every farmer within a mile can see them. They'd have hit the road 2 leagues back in the ravine." Henley did not look convinced, but he also did not stop Ezekiel from walking out of the forge and down the hill toward the fork. There were 7 of them, as Henley had said. 5 were warriors male, heavyset in ring leather and arm guards, with short axes on their belts and spears held loose at their sides. 2 more were something else entirely. One was clearly a subordinate, smaller, holding the reins of a dark-muscled horse. The other was the one giving orders. She stood in front of Alderman Croft's grain wagon with her arms crossed over her chest, and a look of magnificent, absolute authority on her face. And Ezekiel Prescott, who had met orcs before, had traded ironwork and horseshoes and wheel rims with wandering clans for years, stopped walking for just a moment when he saw her. She was tall, nearly as tall as he was, and built in the way of orc women who have earned every muscle they carry. She wore a fitted warrior's bodice of dark-cured leather, laced up the front in a double-cross pattern, a deep forest green that brought out the warm olive gray of her skin. Her leggings were the same leather, practical and close-fitted, tucked into knee-high boots with iron buckles. A short cape of dark fur hung from her left shoulder only, pinned at the collarbone with a bone clasp shaped like 2 curved horns. Her tusks were modest by orc standards, rising just slightly above her lower lip on either side and tipped with small rings of copper. Her hair was black and thick, worn back in a long warrior's braid that fell between her shoulder blades, and her eyes, when she turned them on Ezekiel as he approached, were the amber yellow of late afternoon light through honey. She was, without any ceremony or softening, one of the most striking people Ezekiel Prescott had ever seen in his life. "This is private farmland," Croft was saying, his voice cracking slightly. He was a stout man of 50, and he had not, Ezekiel suspected, ever faced down an Orc Chieftess before. "You have no rights here under the Plateau Accord." "The Plateau Accord," the Orc woman said, with the patience of someone explaining arithmetic to a stone, "gives no clan the right to block water rights from the upper stream, which your mill has been doing for 2 seasons. Her voice was low and precise, accented in the rolling way of the northern Orc dialect, each word given its full weight. "We do not want your grain. We want the sluice gate opened." Ezekiel stepped into the open space at the side of the road. "Chieftess," he said, and she turned those amber eyes on him without surprise, as though she had already noted his approach and simply waited for him to speak. "I'm Ezekiel Prescott. I work the forge on the hill. I don't have any authority over the mill sluice, but I know who does, and I think there's a conversation worth having before this turns into something nobody wants." She studied him, not quickly, not dismissively. She studied him the way a person studies a piece of iron they are deciding whether to work with or set aside. "You are the blacksmith," she said. "That's right. The forge on the hill is built on Gorehorn land. The original deed before your people platted this territory gives the Gorehorn clan grazing and water rights across the plateau in perpetuity." She uncrossed her arms, and one hand came to rest at her belt, fingers easy, not threatening. "My grandfather granted the first human settlers a right to stay when they came here 100 years ago. The mill was not part of that agreement." Ezekiel looked at Croft, who was sweating, and then back at the orc woman. "You're right," he said. Everyone went quiet. Even the wind seemed to consider the word. "I beg your pardon," Croft started. "She's right," Ezekiel said more firmly. "I've read the original plateau deed. My father kept a copy in the forge office because the forge was built on the boundary line and he wanted to make sure we were on the right side of it. The water rights belong to the clan." He looked at the chieftess. "I'll go to the alderman's office with you today if you want a witness, but I'd like to know your name if we're going to do business together." There was a long, measuring silence. One of the male warriors muttered something in the orc tongue that sounded like skepticism. The chieftess silenced him with a single raised finger, not looking away from Ezekiel. "Bagrak," she said. "Bagrak Gorehorn. Chieftess of the Gorehorn Clan, which you are standing on the ancestral lands of blacksmith." "Ezekiel Prescott," he said again. "And I live here because your grandfather was a man of his word, so I try to be one too." Bagrak Gorehorn looked at him for another 3 seconds. Then the corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile, but the suggestion that one existed somewhere in the architecture of her expression. "Then come," she said, "and bring the frightened alderman." The meeting at the alderman's office took 2 hours. Ezekiel sat at the corner of the table and said almost nothing after the first 20 minutes, because Bagrak didn't need him to. She had 3 copies of historical documentation, a surveyor's map drawn in her own hand, and an argument so airtight that even Alderman Ferris, a man who had built his career on finding gaps in agreements, couldn't find a seam to pry. The sluice gate would be opened. The mill would be rerouted to an alternative channel within 30 days. A new agreement would be drafted. When it was done, Bagrak walked out into the street with her warriors at her back and the afternoon sun turning the plateau gold around her, and Ezekiel fell into step beside her without quite deciding to. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. Most humans in your position would have sided with the alderman." "Most humans in my position haven't read the original deed," Ezekiel said, "and most of them don't have a forge sitting on the boundary line that their father spent 20 years maintaining a good relationship across. I have reasons to keep faith with the Gorehorn clan." Bagrak stopped walking. Her warriors continued for a few paces before they too stopped, well-trained, patient. She turned to look at him directly, and up close the amber of her eyes had flecks of green in them that he hadn't noticed before. "What do you want from this?" she asked. "No human acts out of goodwill without a price attached." "My father used to say the same thing," Ezekiel said. "He was wrong about it often enough that I try not to take it as gospel." He held her gaze. "I don't want anything from this except not to have been dishonest about something I know." Bagrak looked at him for a long time. The windmills turned above them on the hill. The grain plateau stretched out in every direction, golden and wide, the kind of landscape that made a man feel small and right-sized at the same time. "Come to the camp this evening," she said. "I will feed you." It was not a question. It was not quite an invitation. It was something in between, in the way that everything Bagrak Gorehorn said seemed to occupy a space that didn't have a clean human word for it. "All right," Ezekiel said. The Gorehorn camp was set at the eastern edge of the plateau, where the land began to slope down toward a creek bed bordered by old oak trees. It was not a war camp. It was a seasonal camp, the kind a large clan makes when they are moving between territories, a dozen hide tents in a loose circle, a central fire already burning by the time Ezekiel arrived, horses picketed in a line, the smell of roasting meat, and something herbal he couldn't identify threading through the evening air. He was watched, obviously. Every set of eyes in the camp tracked him from the moment he came through the outer ring of tents. The children, and there were children, small, gray-green, solemn-faced, peering from behind tent flaps, watched him with the frank curiosity of the very young. The warriors watched him with something more carefully neutral. The older women watched him with the specific assessment of people who have learned to categorize strangers quickly. Bagrak met him at the central fire herself. She had not changed her clothes, but her cape was folded over a tent peg nearby, and her braid had been redone, tighter, with 2 thin copper rings worked into it near the base of her skull. She handed him a wooden bowl of something that smelled like venison and roasted grain and sat down across the fire from him with her own bowl. "You are not afraid," she said. "Should I be?" Most humans would be. Ezekiel looked around the camp with honest attention, not performance. "I see a family," he said. "A large one and a busy one. I don't see anything to be afraid of." Bagrak ate. He ate. The fire crackled between them. "The Gorehorn Clan has a blood price on it," she said after a while, not as confession, as fact, the way a person says there is weather coming. "Placed by the Ironback clan 3 seasons ago, there was a disputed boundary. There were deaths. The Ironback chieftain, Kurak, says the debt is owed in iron or in flesh." Ezekiel set his bowl down on his knee. "That's a serious thing to tell a stranger. I am telling you because you live on the boundary of our territory, and if Kurak's people come to collect, they will come across the plateau road. They will pass your forge." She looked at him across the fire. "I wanted you to know the shape of the ground you are standing on." He thought about that. The fire popped. Somewhere in the camp, someone was playing a low, repetitive melody on a stringed instrument that he didn't know the name of. "How long has this been hanging over you?" he asked. 3 seasons. "And it hasn't been resolved. Kurak will not negotiate. He wants the land and he wants to be seen taking it. The blood price is a pretext." Her jaw tightened just slightly. "He also wants me." The fire seemed to lean slightly toward her when she said it, which was only the wind, but Ezekiel noticed it. "Wants you," he said carefully, "as a conquest, not a wife." The amber eyes met his without flinching. "I have refused. He has increased the blood price as punishment." Ezekiel picked up his bowl again and ate for a moment, working through this. "Then the water rights dispute today was not only about water," Bagrak confirmed. "The Ironback clan has been pressuring the human settlements on the plateau to cut our access to resources, slowly, quietly, so that when they come for the territory we are already weakened. And the alderman is either a fool or in Kurak's pocket. I do not know which yet." Ezekiel exhaled through his nose. "I'd bet on the former, but I'll keep my eyes open for the latter." He finished the last of his bowl and held it out to her. "Thank you for the food, and for telling me." Bagrak took the bowl from him, and when she did, her fingers overlapped his for just a moment, warm, deliberate, unhurried. "Come back tomorrow," she said. "There are things I want to ask you about the forge." He did come back, and the day after that, and the day after that. It was not a courtship at first. It was a working relationship with a dangerous amount of interest underneath it. Bagrak needed ironwork hinges for crates, new rims for 2 of the clan's heavy wagons, replacement blades for 3 tools that had cracked in the cold. Ezekiel needed the business, because the alderman had quietly made it known in the village that the blacksmith was consorting with orcs, and 2 regular customers had already taken their horses to a farrier 3 leagues east rather than bring them to the plateau forge. He didn't tell Bagrak about the lost business. She found out anyway, because she was the kind of woman who found out everything that happened within a 5-mile radius of her camp, and when she did, she came to the forge in the blue hour before sunrise and stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, and that particular look on her face that he was beginning to recognize as controlled fury. "Alderman Ferris told Hector the Cooper that you are a clan friend," she said. "He said it like it was a disease." "I know," Ezekiel said. He was already at the anvil. He worked early because the forge was coolest in the morning and heat in the upper room of the forge house made sleeping past dawn difficult. I heard the same thing. You are losing customers. Some. Because of me. He looked at her. She was standing in the doorway with the dark plateau sky behind her and the forge light painting her in gold and copper, and she looked in that moment like something out of the old stories, not the frightening ones but the true ones, the ones about people who carried whole worlds in their hands and were tired of it. Bagrak, he said, I'm not going to stop doing business with you because Ferris has a small mind. It is not about your pride. It's not about my pride, he agreed. It's about the fact that you're right and I know you're right, and I'd rather lose Hector's barrel orders than spend the next 20 years knowing I looked the other way because it was easier. He turned back to the anvil. Now, did you come here to argue with me at dawn, or did you want to see if the wagon rims are finished? A long silence. He kept working. Both, she said, and walked into the forge. The wagon rims were finished. Bagrak examined them with the seriousness she brought to everything, running her thumb along the seams, testing the weight, checking the join where the iron overlapped. She had the hands of someone who had worked as hard as he had, and she handled iron with a respect that pleased him. These are good work, she said. I know, he said. She glanced at him with a look that was equal parts amusement and surprise. You say that without false modesty. False modesty is a waste of both our time. He set his hammer down. Good work is good work. My father taught me that the worst thing a craftsman can do is pretend his craft is less than it is, because then people think they can pay less for it. Bagrak laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a genuine one, low and brief, like something she hadn't entirely planned to release. She pressed her lips together after it as though reclaiming the sound, but it had already happened, and Ezekiel felt it somewhere behind his sternum like the ring of a well-struck piece of metal. Your father sounds like a practical man, she said. He was. He's been dead 6 years. The forge came to me. And no family of your own, he began wiping down his tools. No. Why not? The plateau is not an easy place to build that kind of life, he said. Winters are long. The work is constant. I've had friendships and I've had something that wasn't quite that twice over, but nothing that stayed. He said it without bitterness, which was how it was true. He had simply gotten accustomed to the shape of a life that was full of work and short on warmth. It was not a tragedy. It was just the specific loneliness of a plateau blacksmith who had his forge and his craft and the long turning of the windmills for company. Bagrak was quiet for a moment. She set the wagon rim down carefully. I understand that, she said. The loneliness of a position. He looked at her. A chieftess does not have companions, she said. She has responsibilities, advisors, subordinates, supplicants. She said it with great evenness as though reciting a list of facts about someone else's life. It is not the same thing. No, he agreed. It isn't. They stood in the forge in the early morning quiet, and something shifted in the air between them. Something that had been building for 3 weeks of daily visits and carefully honest conversations, and the particular way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't paying attention. It didn't resolve itself into words or action. It just settled, warm and present like the forge heat, and they both knew it was there. I will send 3 of my men to help carry the rims, she said. And I will pay you in silver the full market rate. I know you will, he said. She left before the sun fully rose. He watched her go, the dark braids swinging between her shoulder blades, the early light catching the copper rings in her hair, and he stood at the forge doorway for a full minute after she had disappeared down the plateau road before he went back to work. The blood price came to a head 3 weeks after that, and it came in the form of 2 Ironback clan warriors who rode into the village at midday on a market day, when the square was full of stalls and buyers, and posted a proclamation on the village notice board written in both the common tongue and the Orc script. Ezekiel read it in 30 seconds flat. He had learned enough Orc script from his father's trade records to get the gist, and the gist was ugly. Curak Ironback formally declared Bagrak Gorehorn and the Gorehorn Clan in forfeit of the water rights, the plateau grazing lands, and the right of permanent settlement. He gave them 7 days to vacate or face an ironback collection party. He also declared at the bottom of the proclamation that any human settler who aided the Gorehorn clan in defiance of this decree would be considered a blood debt holder and subject to the same forfeit. This was, by any reasonable reading, a declaration of war. Quiet, legally dressed, but war. The 2 ironback warriors sat on their horses in the market square and watched the humans read the proclamation with the air of men who expected nothing interesting to happen. Ezekiel walked to the notice board, unpinned the proclamation, folded it twice, and put it in his apron pocket. "Hey," one of the warriors started. "I'm keeping this for evidence," Ezekiel said, "in case anyone wants to dispute the exact wording in front of a territorial judge." He looked up at them with the kind of calm that comes from spending one's entire working life in proximity to things that could kill you if you made one careless move. "Tell Kurak Ironback that the Plateau Accord dispute resolution process is still in effect, and that any collection action conducted without a proper tribunal ruling will be considered a breach of the accord, which carries its own penalties." He folded his arms. "Now, is there anything else?" The 2 warriors exchanged a look. They were not certain what to do with this. They had expected fear or compliance or possibly blustering human outrage that they could dismiss easily. They had not expected a soot-armed blacksmith quoting treaty law at them with the serenity of a man who had been thinking about this for weeks. Because Ezekiel had, in fact, been thinking about this for weeks. Because Bagrak had told him it was coming, and he had spent his evenings reading the Plateau Accord documents he'd inherited from his father in a battered leather folder, and he had found the clause about dispute resolution, and he had written 3 letters to the territorial court at Amberton asking for a formal opinion. The warriors left. Ezekiel went directly to the Gorehorn camp. Bagrak met him outside her tent before he'd gotten 20 paces inside the camp perimeter, which meant her scouts had already told her about the market square. Of course they had. "You took the proclamation," she said. "I'm having it reviewed by the territorial court." He held it out to her. "But you should see it first." She took it and read it, and her face was still and controlled throughout, and he watched the muscles along her jaw tighten once, briefly, and then release. "He is demanding an answer within 7 days, she said. "I know. The court at Amberton can't respond in 7 days, which means this is designed to give him a pretext to move before any legal remedy can be applied." Ezekiel sat down on a nearby log without being invited because he had been coming here long enough that the formalities had worn thin. "So we need a different play." Bagrak looked at him steadily. "We," she said, not a question. Just the word given back to him weighted with everything it implied. "I live on your ancestral land," he said simply. "He's named me a debt holder. Whether I like it or not, I'm already in this. You didn't have to take the proclamation down." "No," he agreed. "I wanted to." Bagrak sat down across from him, not on the log but cross-legged on the ground with the naturalness of someone who has spent her life outdoors. She set the proclamation on the dirt between them. The afternoon was warm, the plateau stretching away in golden waves of grain around the camp's perimeter, the windmills turning slowly against a blue sky. "There is an Orc custom," she said. "The challenge circle. It is a formal declaration of territorial right. A clan posts a circle of stones on disputed ground, and any claimant who walks through it publicly is committing to defend their right in open challenge. It stops escalation because it forces the dispute into the open, under witness." She looked at the proclamation. "If I post the circle here, on the plateau, in front of witnesses from both clans, Kurak cannot make a quiet collection. He has to respond openly, and an open response can be judged by other chieftains. What are the risks? He will send a champion. Ironback custom allows it. The champion fights on behalf of Kurak's claim. I fight on behalf of mine. The victor's clan holds the right." She said this with great steadiness as though it were a contract term. Ezekiel looked at her for a long moment. "And if he sends someone bigger than you, then I will still win," she said, and there was not arrogance in it. There was just the absolute clarity of a woman who knows exactly what she is capable of. "All right," he said, "post the circle, I'll be there." Ezekiel. She said his name, and it was the first time she had used it directly, without the title or the slight formality she usually maintained, and it landed on him like a hand placed on the center of his chest. "You understand that if you stand witness at a challenge circle, you will be seen as formally allied with the Gorehorn Clan. The blood price Kurak posted applies to you fully from that moment. I know. You could leave the plateau, go south, find work in a city, be clear of all of this." He looked at her, at the amber gold eyes and the copper rings in her braid and the straight line of her back, and the way she held herself with the weight of an entire clan's survival on her shoulders without bending an inch under it. "I could," he said. "I don't want to." The word she said in response was in the Orc tongue, and he didn't know it. But the way she said it, low, quiet, a sound from somewhere deep, told him it was not a small word. The challenge circle was posted 3 days later before dawn on the highest flat point of the plateau where all 3 roads met, and the windmills could be seen in every direction. Bagrak and 4 of her clan elders placed the stones themselves, a circle 20 feet across, each stone the size of a man's head, set into the earth with care and ceremony, each one marked on its flat face with the Gorehorn Clan mark in red ochre. Word spread across the plateau and down into the valleys the way fire spreads, fast, consuming, touching everything. By mid-morning, there were people on the hill roads, farmers, villagers, a few traders who happened to be passing through and had no intention of leaving before seeing what happened. By noon, there were perhaps 80 humans on the plateau and another 40 orcs from various clans who had heard the circle call and come to witness. Kurak Ironback arrived at midday with a party of 20, which was deliberately intimidating and also technically within the rules of the circle custom. He was a large orc, older than Bagrak by 15 years, with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. He wore full iron plate armor that had been recently polished and rode a horse that was too large for the plateau roads, which meant he had brought it specifically for this appearance. He looked at the circle. He looked at Bagrak, who stood 20 feet from it with her arms at her sides and her chin level, meeting his gaze without movement. Then he looked at Ezekiel Prescott, who was standing 6 feet to Bagrak's left with his forge apron off and his best shirt on and his arms crossed, and Kurak's eyes narrowed with a particular contempt. "You brought a human pet," Kurak said, in the common tongue, loud enough for the crowd to hear. Bagrak said nothing. Kurak turned to his party and said something in the Ironback dialect that made several of them laugh. Then he swung down from his horse and walked toward the circle with deliberate slowness, the way a man walks when he expects everyone to watch him. "The custom requires," he announced to the crowd in a formal voice, "that any party wishing to contest the circle must walk through it without flinching. The Orc Chieftess has posted her claim. I contest it. I will send my champion to walk the circle against her." He gestured back toward his party. A man, an orc, enormous, the biggest Ezekiel had seen outside of old illustrated histories, dismounted and came forward. He was a full head taller than Bagrak, and his arms were the width of Ezekiel's thighs, and he carried a war axe in one hand the way Ezekiel carried his hammer. He had the look of a man who had never lost anything. The crowd murmured. Ezekiel heard the word Skarek go through the human watchers, and the note in the way they said it told him this champion had a reputation. "Skarek of the Ironback," Kurak announced. "He has walked 12 challenge circles and won them all." Bagrak stepped forward to the edge of the stone ring. She looked at Skarek across the diameter of the circle, 20 feet of open ground, stone marked at the perimeter, watched by 120 people. She said in a clear, carrying voice, "The circle is posted. I walk it as the claimant. If your champion has a challenge, he may walk it after me." Then she walked into the circle. She walked through it with her arms loose at her sides and her head up, and if she felt the crowd watching, she gave no sign of it. She walked to the center, turned to face outward, and stood. Skerek walked in from the opposite side. He was grinning, a wide, lazy grin, the grin of a man doing something he considers beneath him. He got to the center, 2 feet from Bagrak, and he looked down at her with the expectation of someone waiting for a reaction. Bagrak Gorehorn did not flinch. The grin on Skerek's face faltered. He had expected Ezekiel could read it in the slight shift of his shoulders, some small movement, some tension, some acknowledgement of the difference in their size. There was none. Bagrak looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly, without drama, with the complete and settled certainty of someone who knows exactly where she stands. "The circle is mine," she said. "If you have a challenge, name it." Skerek named it. He swung the war axe. What happened next took approximately 4 seconds, and would be talked about on the Gorehorn Plateau for the next 12 years. Bagrak stepped inside the axe's arc rather than away from it. A movement so sudden and tight that it took the entire crowd an involuntary half-breath to process, caught Skerek's weapon arm at the wrist with her right hand, pivoted on her left heel with a speed that seemed impossible for someone who had been standing perfectly still a moment before, and used his own momentum and the leverage of her grip to put 260 pounds of Ironback champion face first into the dry plateau earth. The sound Skerek made when he landed was less a word than a condition. Bagrak placed one boot on his wrist, not his back, not his neck, his wrist, just enough pressure to keep the weapon hand still, and looked up at Kurak across the circle. "The circle is mine," she said again. The crowd was absolutely silent. "The claim stands. The Plateau Accord water rights stand. The Gorehorn settlement rights stand." She stepped back, releasing Skerek's wrist. He did not get up immediately. "If Chieftain Kurak wishes to contest this through the formal tribunal process, he is welcome to make that application. The territorial court at Amberton has already received documentation of the original deed. I am told the response is expected within 6 weeks. Then the crowd erupted. It was not all cheering. Some of the human watchers were too stunned to make any sound. Some of the Ironback party was very still in the way of people recalculating. But enough of the crowd, the farmers who had watched Kurak's men quarter-starve the plateau of its water, the traders who had been strong-armed on the plateau roads, the orc witnesses from clans who had their own reasons to see Ironback ambition checked, enough of them, made enough noise that the sound rolled out across the golden grain like a wave. Kurak Ironback stood on his side of the circle and looked at Bagrak with a face like compressed iron. He was not finished, and they both knew it. But he was publicly, formally, ceremonially beaten today, and that was the thing about the challenge circle. What was witnessed could not be unwitnessed. He gathered his party and left without speaking again. Ezekiel had not moved from his position 6 feet outside the circle for the entire length of the confrontation. When it was over, and the crowd began to break apart into excited clusters of conversation, Bagrak walked out of the circle and stopped directly in front of him. She was breathing slightly harder than normal. Her braid had not shifted. There was a thin layer of plateau dust on her boots. "You didn't flinch either," she said. When Skerek came in, half the crowd stepped back. "I was watching you," Ezekiel said. "I didn't need to be afraid, you had it." Bagrak looked at him, and the amber in her eyes was very warm, and for a moment the crowd and the windmills and the wide gold plateau all seemed to recede to a comfortable distance. "Come to the camp tonight," she said. "Not for business." He came. The camp was quieter than usual, the central fire lower, most of the clan inside their tents by the time the stars had properly come out. Bagrak was sitting outside her tent on a folded blanket with a tin cup in her hand, and she handed him one when he sat down beside her without asking whether he wanted it. It was something warm and herbed and slightly bitter, and it was, he discovered, exactly what he wanted. They sat close, closer than they had sat before, not touching but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her arm alongside his, and the night was cool enough that the warmth mattered. "You took the proclamation down in the market square," she said. "You walked to the challenge circle. You stood witness when it cost you customers and safety." She looked at the fire rather than at him. "Why?" "I told you." I'm in this regardless now. Before the proclamation, before you were formally implicated, you came to the alderman meeting. You read the deed aloud. You called me right when it was easier to say nothing. He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. An owl called from the oak trees along the creek. Because you were right, he said, and because he stopped. The second part was harder. Because, she prompted, still looking at the fire. Because I've been on this plateau for 6 years since my father died, and it's a good life, it's an honest life, and it's very quiet, he said. And then you showed up at the fork in the road and told the alderman the truth to his face and walked into the office with your documents and your surveyor's map. And I thought, there is a person who is actually alive. He exhaled slowly. I didn't want to look away from that. Bagrak was quiet for a long time. The fire crackled. I was prepared to dislike you, she said. Every human man I have dealt with in a position of power has either wanted to use me or wanted to be rid of me. I expected you to be the same. I know. You were not. No. She turned to look at him, and he turned to look at her, and they were very close, and the firelight was doing things to the amber of her eyes and the copper rings in her braid. And Ezekiel Prescott, who was not given to impulsive decisions or dramatic gestures, reached out slowly and tucked a loose strand of her black hair back from her face with one finger. She did not move away. She watched him do it with the focused, serious attention she brought to everything, and then she reached up and covered his hand with hers, holding it against the side of her face, and her hand was warm and strong and deliberate. Chieftesses do not usually take human companions, she said. I know. The clan will have opinions. I expect so. Kurak will use it. He'll say it proves I've gone soft, gone foreign. Will you let him say that? She turned her face slightly into his palm, and the gesture was small and private and more intimate than anything either of them had said, and she said, no. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, slow and deliberate, and without any of the uncertainty he might have expected, because Bagrak Gorehorn did not do anything without intention, and the intention in this was very clear. He kissed her back with the same honesty he brought to everything he did, and the fire burned low between them and the windmills turned against the stars, and the plateau was wide and golden and quiet around them. When they finally broke apart, she stayed close, her forehead near his temple, and he could hear the slight change in her breathing that told him this had not been as controlled an act as she usually managed. I have decided, she said quietly against his ear, that you are worth keeping. I'm glad, he said. His voice was rougher than he intended, because I wasn't planning on going anywhere. She laughed again, that low, surprised, briefly released sound, and this time she did not press her lips together after it. She let it happen, and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat by the fire until the embers went gray, and it was the first night in 6 years that Ezekiel Prescott felt warm all the way through. The following weeks were not peaceful. Kurak Ironback was not a man who accepted public defeat gracefully, and the Challenge Circle outcome had traveled fast through the plateau network of traders and travelers. 3 nights after the circle, 2 of Bagrak's clan scouts found signs of Ironback riders on the northern boundary of the plateau, moving quietly without announcement. Not a raid party, not yet, but reconnaissance, which was its own kind of declaration. Ezekiel rode up to the camp the morning after the scouts' report and found Bagrak and her senior advisors in conference around the central fire, a map spread on a flat stone between them. He tied his horse and came and sat at the edge of the circle without being asked, and no one in the group objected, which itself was a measure of how much the camp's attitude toward him had shifted in the previous weeks. The northern boundary is the most exposed, said the advisor named Droga, a weathered female elder with close-cropped gray hair and the careful manner of someone who has been right about difficult things for a long time. If Kurak moves there, he can cut the creek access and the north road simultaneously. He won't raid directly, said Varon, the young warrior captain, leaning over the map. Not after the circle. He'll try to make life difficult enough that we relocate voluntarily. He will also try to embarrass her, said Droga, with a slight emphasis on the last word that was aimed, Ezekiel noticed, partly in his direction. Not hostile, calculating, assessing the new factor. Let him try, Bagrak said. She was tracing the north boundary on the map with one finger. Ezekiel, she didn't look up. You know the North Road. Is there anywhere along it that naturally channels riders into a predictable path? He thought about it. He had ridden the North Road 300 times. 2 places, he said. The stone bridge at the creek crossing its single cart width. No way around it without going 30 yards into the reed bed, which is boggy this time of year. And the gap between the old storage barn and the windmill station at the top of the grade. It's narrow enough that you couldn't pass more than 2 horses side by side. The bridge, Bagrak said. That is where I would put watchers. I'll ride up with your scouts this afternoon and show them exactly which approach lines are visible from the bridge, Ezekiel said. Droga looked at him with a slightly different expression than before. He couldn't fully read Orc expressions yet, he was learning, but it took time, but the shift in her face seemed closer to consideration than suspicion. You are choosing difficult ground to stand on, she said to him directly in the plain way of Orc elders who do not consider indirection a courtesy. Yes, he said, for her. He met the elder's gray eyes. For the right of it and for her. I can't honestly separate those 2 things. A silence moved around the fire. Bagrak had stopped tracing the map and was looking at the stones instead, very still. Droga said something in the Orc tongue, brief, and one of the younger advisors exhaled sharply through his nose, not in anger, Ezekiel decided, but in the Orc equivalent of reluctant acknowledgement. The North Road scouts will leave at midday, Bagrak said, moving on with the smooth efficiency of a woman who has decided something without announcing it. Ezekiel rides with them. He rode with them, and the afternoon passed in the productive tension of people doing careful, necessary work together. He showed the scouts the bridge approach and the bottleneck at the windmill station, and the scouts, 2 women and a young man who had watched him with elaborate skepticism for the first half of the ride, began talking to him like a colleague by the time they turned back toward camp. They returned to find the camp in a state of controlled activity. A messenger had come from the village, not from Alderman Ferris, but from 3 of the independent farmers whose land bordered the plateau's southern edge. They had heard about the challenge circle outcome, and had sent word that they would not honor the unofficial boycott Ferris had been pushing. 2 of them were prepared to send letters to the territorial court at Amberton in support of the Gorehorn Clan's historical claim. This was the kind of thing that could change the shape of a fight. Ezekiel took the letters himself because he had the clearest relationship with the court contacts, and because the farmer who had sent them, a wide-faced man named Talbot with barley fields that ran to the plateau's south edge, was an old acquaintance of his father's and trusted the Prescott name in a way that would carry weight with the alderman's office. He was back at camp by evening. Bagrak was at the corral when he arrived, checking the hooves on the clan's working horses with the methodical attention she gave to the maintenance of everything that kept her clan safe and functional. She didn't stop when he came up, but she glanced at him once briefly, with the particular quality of acknowledgement that in Bagrak's vocabulary meant she was glad he was back. He unsaddled his own horse and put it in the corral and came and stood beside her, and without discussion or ceremony began checking the opposite end of the horse line, because he had grown up around horses and knew what he was looking for. They worked in easy parallel for half an hour, and it was so ordinary, so companionable, so exactly like the kind of shared daily labor that he had thought might never be part of his life, that he had to stop once and look up at the turning windmills on the hill to make sure he was actually here, actually doing this, actually standing in a warm plateau evening next to a woman who made him feel like the world was big enough to be worth being in. 3 farmers on the south boundary are riding to Amberton, he said. Bagrak looked up from a rear hoof she was examining, Talbot included. Talbot is writing the primary letter. He says if your claim is upheld, He wants to negotiate a direct water-sharing agreement, bypass the mill entirely. That is a better outcome than anything I planned for, she said. I know. She set the hoof down and straightened and looked at him over the horse's back. The setting sun was doing extraordinary things to the plateau, turning the grain sea amber gold, making the windmill blades glow at their edges. And she was standing in the middle of all that light, and she was part of it in his mind, fully and without his having decided when exactly that had happened. "Thank you," she said. It was a word she did not say lightly, and she said it looking directly at him. "Stop thanking me," he said, not unkindly. "I keep telling you I'm here because I want to be here." "I know," she said. "I'm beginning to believe it." That night she came to the forge house. It was late, full dark, the plateau wind running soft through the grain fields, and he heard the knock and opened the door, and there she was, still in her fighting leathers, the copper rings in her braid catching the lamp light from inside. She did not explain her presence or offer a reason. She simply looked at him with the directness that was the most characteristic thing about her. He stepped back to let her in. She came in. He put the kettle on because it was something to do with his hands. They talked until the fire burned low about the clan, about the court letters, about a memory of his father that he hadn't shared with anyone before, about a winter 3 years ago when the Gorehorn Clan had been cut off by snow on the high plateau for 6 weeks, and Bagrak had kept 40 people warm and fed and functional through sheer refusal to allow any other outcome. She told it without drama, the way she told everything, and he listened the way he listened to everything fully, without impatience. At some point the kettle went unnoticed and untouched, and they were sitting very close on the bench by the fire, and her head was tipped slightly against his shoulder, and his hand was holding hers on the bench between them, fingers interlaced, her grip firm and warm and absolutely present. "I am not a soft woman," she said quietly to the fire. "I know. I am not good at being." She paused, and he could hear her searching for the word tender. "My mother was. My mother was warm and fierce in equal measure, and people came to her for comfort as much as for leadership. I have always been better at the leadership." "You are warmer than you think," he said. She was quiet. "The night you told me about the blood price," he said. "You were warning me so I could leave if I wanted. That was tender, Bagrak. You didn't have to do that." She turned her face against the top of his shoulder, a small movement, and he tightened his hand on hers. "I did not want you to leave," she said. "I know," he said. "I didn't want to." She kissed him then, less deliberately than the first time, quicker, like a thing she couldn't quite manage not to do, and he kissed her back with the full warmth of everything he hadn't said yet and didn't need to say in words, and the forge house was quiet and warm, and the windmills turned outside in the dark. He didn't let it go further than that, not that night. Not because he didn't want to, that particular honesty was becoming very hard to manage, but because they were both in the middle of something dangerous and unfinished, and he wanted it to be right when it was right, fully right, without Bagrak Ironback's shadow in the corner of it. She seemed to understand this without being told. She stayed until almost midnight, and when she left she pressed her palm flat against his chest for a moment, feeling his heartbeat, a gesture so simple and intimate it nearly undid him, and then she walked back down the hill to the camp. He stood in the forge doorway in the dark for a long time after she had gone, the plateau spread out below him, the windmills turning silver in the moonlight, feeling the warm, solid weight of something enormous that had taken up residence in his chest. The response from the territorial court at Amberton arrived on the 32nd day after Ezekiel's first letters, brought by a court courier on a fast horse who looked like he had ridden hard and was not sorry about it. The court found the Gorehorn clan's claim to plateau water rights valid under the original deed. The court further found that Bagrak Ironback's proclamation constituted an unauthorized challenge to the accord without a formal dispute filing, making it legally void. The court ordered Alderman Ferris to facilitate the sluice rerouting within 30 days under penalty of accord sanction. The court additionally noted that a formal complaint regarding Ironback pressure on plateau settlements had been received from 3 independent landholders and would be investigated. It was not a total resolution. Gorehorn was not gone. His claim to want the territory had not disappeared, and men like Gorehorn did not accept court rulings with grace. But the legal ground had shifted firmly and publicly, and public ground in Bagrak's world was territory. Bagrak read the court document at the central fire with Droga and Varen, and two other advisors standing around her. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the group. When she finished reading, she folded the document once, with great precision, and she looked at Ezekiel with an expression that was the most openly moved he had ever seen on her face, controlled, as always, but with something underneath the control that was big and warm and real. "The clan owes you a debt," Droga said to Ezekiel. She said it without hesitation, which was a different woman from the one who had called him difficult ground 3 weeks before. "The clan owes me nothing," Ezekiel said. "This is what should have happened from the beginning." Droga made the brief orc sound of reluctant acknowledgement again. Then she said something to Bagrak in the orc tongue that made Varen look away quickly, suppressing something, and Bagrak's jaw moved slightly. "What did she say?" Ezekiel asked Bagrak quietly as the others drifted away with the document. Bagrak looked at him. "She said," Bagrak said, "that a man who walks into a challenge circle situation without flinching and then writes letters to a territorial court is either a fool or someone worth keeping. Which does she think I am?" She did not say, but the corner of Bagrak's mouth moved in the way that meant she was not unhappy about the ambiguity. Gorehorn made his final play 2 weeks after the court decision, and it was not a military one. It was a political one, which made it more dangerous. He sent word to 7 other clan chieftains across the plateau region and the valleys below, inviting them to a grand council, an ancient orc tradition, the gathering of chieftains to hear disputes too large for individual resolution. He presented his case, that the Orc Chieftess had abandoned orc custom by taking a human ally, that her judgment was compromised, that the water rights dispute was secondary to the question of whether she was still fit to lead. It was, everyone who heard it recognized, completely cynical. It was also, in the structure of orc political tradition, a legitimate move. The council was called for a 3-day ride north, at the meeting grounds of the neutral Stoneback clan. Bagrak received the summons and was quiet for a full day before she spoke about it to anyone. When she did speak, she came to the forge. Ezekiel was working on a new set of hinges for the camp's storage chest. Nothing urgent, just the regular work of his craft. He heard her come in and he kept working, because she sometimes needed a few minutes in a space before she was ready to talk. She sat on the stool by the window that she had started to think of as hers, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Gorehorn has called a grand council. He is challenging my fitness to lead." Ezekiel set his hammer down. "On what grounds?" "Our alliance." She said it plainly. "He is calling me compromised. A chieftess who takes a human to her side is, under very old custom, considered to have divided her loyalty. Is that custom actually enforceable? It was not used for 150 years. It is technically still in the law." She paused. 7 chieftains will be present. 4 of them already lean toward Gorehorn because Gorehorn controls trade routes they depend on. 2 are neutral. 1 is Droga's cousin, which helps. "What happens if the council rules against you?" She looked at him very steadily. "I am removed as chieftess." The Gorehorn clan's leadership passes to the eldest male of the warrior line, who is 17 years old and has never negotiated anything harder than a trade route. She paused again, and Gorehorn takes what he has been building toward from the beginning. The weight of it sat in the forge like something with its own presence. "Can you make the case without me?" he asked. "Go to the council, present the water rights victory, the court decision, the alliance of the plateau farmers." "Yes," she said. "But Gorehorn will use you as the argument. He will say the court victory was won because of a human's influence. He will say I am dependent on a man to do what a chieftess should do alone." "That is not what happened." "No," she said. "You know that, and I know that, and Droga knows that. 7 chieftains who are weighing political cost will hear what Gorehorn tells them." Ezekiel came and sat on the floor near her stool. He did not think of himself as a strategic man, but he had grown up watching his father navigate the complicated politics of being a craftsman whom many people needed but none wanted to publicly favor. He knew something about the geometry of being useful and being used. "Take me with you," he said. Bagrak looked at him sharply. "Take me to the council. Let Kurak make his argument, then let me make mine. You cannot speak at a grand council. You are not an Orc chieftain. I am a party to the dispute. Under the accord, any affected landholding party to a territorial dispute has standing to present testimony." He had read this too in his father's documents in the section on tribunal procedure. "I won't speak as your ally or your," he paused briefly, "companion. I'll speak as the blacksmith on the boundary, as a landholding party, as a man who has the original deed and the court decision and the letters from the plateau farmers. Let the council hear it from someone who was there." Bagrak stared at him. In all the time he had known her, he had not seen her genuinely uncertain about something twice. This was the second time. "Kurak will paint you as a fool or a love-struck idiot," she said. "Let him. The documents don't care what Kurak thinks." A very long silence. The forge fire breathed. "You understand," she said slowly, "that walking into a grand council as the human companion of an Orc Chieftess is a different kind of challenge circle entirely." "I know," he said. "I'll walk it anyway." He held her gaze and she held his, and the amber in her eyes was fierce and warm, and something else entirely that he recognized from the night she had held his hand against her face by the fire. "Then we go together," she said. "We leave tomorrow at dawn." The ride north took 3 days, as Kurak's summons had promised. Bagrak rode with Droga and Varen and 4 warriors. Ezekiel rode on his own horse, and he rode beside Bagrak rather than behind, which earned him a long evaluating look from Droga on the first morning and then no further comment, which he took as a favorable sign. The plateau gave way to rougher country going north rockier, with dark pine stands replacing the golden grain, the windmills left behind, the sky bigger and colder. They camped 2 nights on the road, efficient fires, practical arrangements, and on both nights Bagrak slept near enough to him that if either of them shifted in the night their arms would touch, which several times they did, and neither of them moved away. The Stoneback meeting grounds were a wide, flat clearing between 2 rock faces, ringed with ancient carved pillars that had been there since before any living Orc's grandfather. The 7 chieftains were already there when the Gorehorn party arrived, 4 men and 3 women, all in full clan wear, their parties behind them. Kurak Ironback was at the far side of the clearing, and he watched Bagrak's party come in with the specific attentiveness of a man counting pieces on a game board. When he saw Ezekiel riding at Bagrak's side, his expression shifted through something fast and complicated and landed on contempt. Calculated contempt deployed publicly for the benefit of the watching chieftains. "She brings her human," he announced, loud enough for the clearing to hear. Bagrak did not look at him. She dismounted, handed her reins to Varen, and walked to the speaking stone at the center of the ring of pillars with the same unhurried certainty she brought to every space she entered. Ezekiel dismounted and followed her. He had dressed that morning with care, not for display but for clarity. His cleanest shirt, his coat, his boots. He carried the leather document folder that had belonged to his father, and inside it were the original deed, the court ruling, the letters from the 3 plateau farmers, and a carefully written summary of events that he had spent the second night of the journey composing by firelight while Bagrak sharpened her belt knife nearby. And Droga watched him write with an expression that had moved, he thought, from skeptical to something approaching intrigued. The council opened. Kurak made his case, and he made it well, because he was not a stupid man. He was a strategic, ruthless, politically literate man who had been building this campaign for 3 seasons. He spoke about Orc tradition, about the dangers of divided loyalty, about the water rights dispute as evidence of Bagrak's weakness rather than her strength. He did not say anything outright false. He arranged truths in the order that served him. Then Bagrak spoke. She was magnificent. She was calm and precise, and she did not raise her voice once, and she dismantled Curak's framing piece by piece with the methodical surety of a craftsperson at work on a piece of iron they know very well. The water rights were won legally and historically. The court at Amberton had ruled. The alliance with plateau settlers was a matter of practical diplomacy, not divided loyalty. She had not given anything away. She had recovered what had always been owed. Then she said, "The affected landholding party to the boundary dispute has requested the right to give testimony before this council under accord procedure." 6 of the 7 chieftains looked at Ezekiel. The 7th, a woman from the western valleys named Gara, whose expression had been unreadable throughout, looked at the carved pillars, thinking. Curak said, "A human has no place in a grand council." "Accord procedure says otherwise," Bagrak said, with exquisite patience. "Do any of the chieftains object on procedural grounds?" A silence. None of them objected on procedural grounds, because none of them wanted to be the one who had violated accord procedure in a session being witnessed by their own clan parties. Ezekiel stepped to the speaking stone. He opened the document folder. He laid out the deed, and the court ruling and the farmer's letters, and he walked through each one with the unhurried, clear voice of a man who has nothing to hide and knows it. He spoke about the plateau's history. He spoke about the original settlement agreement and his father's copy of the deed. He spoke about Alderman Ferris's quiet campaign to cut the clan's resources, which he named as political harassment with documentary support. He spoke about the challenge circle as a witness, describing what he had seen and what the crowd had seen and what the implications were for public orc law. He spoke for 20 minutes, and he did not flinch once. When he was done, he looked at the council, and then he said the last part. "I came here because I live on the boundary of Gorehorn ancestral land, because the documents in front of you support the Gorehorn Clan's claim completely, and because Chieftess Bagrak Gorehorn is the most honest person I have dealt with in 6 years on this plateau. Whatever this council decides, those things will remain true." He stepped back. The clearing was quiet. Gara, the Western Valley Chieftess, spoke first. She said she found the historical evidence compelling, the court ruling persuasive, and the challenge circle outcome decisive. She would not support Curak's motion. The second neutral chieftain followed and said the same. Droga's cousin spoke at some length about accord procedure and historical precedent and concluded the same way. That was 3 votes against and 4 still to move, and Curak had been expecting 4-4. But the 4th and 5th votes, 2 of the men who controlled his trade routes looked at the document folder, at the court ruling at each other, and voted against, because they were political men who had just watched Curak lose the evidence war in front of witnesses, and political men do not ride a losing horse past the point where they can dismount. Curak got 2 votes, his own declaration and 1 other. The motion failed. The Ironback blood price was formally declared void. The plateau water rights were upheld. The Gorehorn Clan's leadership was confirmed. Curak Ironback was censured for filing an improper challenge and ordered to pay a formal fine to the Stoneback neutral clan for the cost of convening. He left the meeting grounds without speaking to anyone. His party followed. Ezekiel was standing 3 paces outside the speaker's stone ring when Bagrak came to him. The other chieftains were dispersing, speaking with their parties, the clearing filling with the normal busy sounds of a session concluding. Droga was speaking rapidly with Gara. Varen was grinning the wide, surprised grin of someone who had just watched something improbable go right. Bagrak stopped in front of Ezekiel. He could see it now after weeks of learning to read her, shaking slightly, very finely, the way a taut wire shakes when the tension is released. "You prepared that testimony on the road," she said. "Second night by the fire. You did not tell me. I didn't want you to argue me out of it." She exhaled through her nose, which was the orc equivalent of a very expressive laugh. "I would have. I know. It worked." "It worked," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment, in the way she had of looking at things fully, entirely, without reservation. And then she stepped forward and put her arms around him, and it was the first time she had done that, just held him plainly, without any purpose beyond the fact of it. He put his arms around her back and held on, and she was warm and strong and real, and her braid was against his cheek, and he could feel her heartbeat against his chest, and he thought, with a certainty that was quiet and deep and completely without doubt, here, this is here. Droga is watching, she said against his shoulder. I know. Half the council is watching. I know. You do not care. No, he said. I really do not care. She pulled back enough to look at him, close, amber eyes warmer than he had ever seen them. Neither do I, she said, and it sounded like something she had surprised herself with and liked. They rode back to the plateau over 3 days that were nothing like the 3 days going north. The tension that had ridden alongside the party like an uninvited companion was gone, burned off in the meeting grounds, and what was left was something lighter, something that permitted laughter at camp, permitted Varen to tell a long, outlandish story about a bear he had apparently once fought, permitted Droga to quiz Ezekiel about plateau farming practices, with the frank curiosity of someone who has decided to be interested in a thing after spending a month pretending not to be. On the second night of the return, when the camp was quiet and the fire was low and the other party members were asleep or the orc equivalent of it, Bagrak and Ezekiel sat together in the same warm proximity they had been building toward for weeks, and there was something present between them that was different from the first night at the campfire, different from the night at the forge house. It was older. It had been through things. It had weight and history and shape. She turned to look at him in the firelight, and he turned to look at her, and she said, very quietly, I want you to stay. He knew what she meant, not just on the plateau, not just in the alliance. He knew what she meant. I want that too, he said. She reached up and touched his face with her palm, the way she had held his hand against her face that first night at the fire, mirrored, returned, completed. He leaned into it. She brought her other hand up, framing his face, looking at him with the full, unguarded attention that she so rarely gave to anything, and he looked back at her, and the fire made them golden, and the pine trees were dark and quiet around the camp, and the stars were extraordinary above them. He kissed her, slower and deeper than any of the times before, and she kissed him back with the directness and warmth that was the most particularly her thing about her, and eventually they moved apart from the fire, close together, and the night was long and warm and honest, and what passed between them in the dark hours was everything that two people can offer each other when they have decided that this is the one. This is the person. This is what the world has been building toward. And it was unhurried and real, and full of the particular joy of things that are finally what they should be. In the morning she was already up when he woke, the way she was always already up, standing at the edge of the camp looking at the southern sky. He came and stood beside her. The plateau road, she said, 2 more days. And then the work begins again, the sluice rerouting, the new water agreement with Talbot, the court filing to formalize the claim. Yes, he said. And the forge, she said. The camp needs a second fire pit, and the hinges on 4 of the tent frames need replacement. I know, he said. I was going to mention the hinges. She turned to look at him sideways, and she was smiling, really smiling, the full version, the one that had been building in the corners of her expressions for weeks and was now simply there, open, unhidden, and it made her face do something extraordinary. I have been thinking, she said, about. The forge is on the boundary line. It sits, technically, on Gorehorn land by the original deed. She said it with great evenness. It has always seemed to me that a forge on Gorehorn land should be, in some formal sense, a Gorehorn forge. He looked at her. Are you trying to claim my forge in the most romantic way I have ever heard? I am proposing, she said with dignity, a formal partnership arrangement between the blacksmith of the plateau and the Gorehorn Clan, which would give the forge a recognized status under Orc customary law as a clan-allied holding, which would mean any attempt to displace the forge or its operator would require a full Grand Council vote. And the forge's operator, he said, what status does he get? Under Orc customary law, she said, looking at the sky again. A formally recognized alliance partner of a chieftess is considered a clan bond companion, which is not the same as a subordinate or a dependent. It is she paused, and he could hear her selecting the word with care, a counterpart. A counterpart, he said. An equal partner, she said, in law and in standing, and she stopped. In everything else, he finished. She looked at him, and the amber in her eyes was full of morning light. In everything else, she agreed. He reached over and took her hand, holding it the way he had held it the first time, fingers interlaced, and she held his back with the same firm, warm, absolute grip. "Then yes," he said, "I accept the terms of the partnership." The weeks that followed were the busiest of Ezekiel Prescott's life. The formal recognition of the forge as a clan allied holding required documentation, which he drafted with help from the territorial court contacts who were, by this point, familiar enough with Gorehorn Plateau affairs that they treated the correspondence with friendly efficiency. The sluice rerouting for the mill required ironwork, new channel gates, new mounting hardware, new connectors, and it was his busiest month at the forge since the spring rush 4 years previous. He hired an apprentice, a quiet 17-year-old from the village named Darrow, who had been turned down by 3 other forge masters for being too slow to talk, but had hands that were naturally suited to the work. Ezekiel put him on the bellows and the basic shaping work and paid him fairly, and Darrow came in every morning without being asked, and left every evening after the forge was clean, and within 6 weeks he was good, and within 3 months he was genuinely useful. This mattered because it meant Ezekiel could take a full day away from the forge without everything stopping, which mattered because Bagrak's schedule was not respectful of forge hours, and he had learned not to be perfectly respectful of them either. He moved into the camp formally. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, which was how things happened between them, not by dramatic declaration but by accumulation. His spare tools appeared in a chest near her tent. A second bowl appeared at the camp fire for meals. The horse he had been tying at the camp corral for months got a permanent peg, with his name scratched into the wood in Varen's handwriting. Droga performed the formal clan bond ceremony on a bright autumn morning at the central fire, with every member of the clan and Darrow, the apprentice, and old Talbot from the South Farms all present, and it was brief and simple and full of an unexpected gravity that made Ezekiel's throat tight in a way he had not anticipated. Bagrak stood at his left side with her hand in his, and looked at him during the whole of Droga's words with an expression that was open and warm and fully present in a way that she allowed only here, with him, and it was, he thought, the most beautiful thing he had ever been given. The settlement of the Curak matter came through the territorial court the following spring. Curak Ironback's clan was formally sanctioned for 3 violations of the plateau accord across a 7-year period that the court's investigation had uncovered. His trade route privileges were restricted for 2 years pending compliance review. 2 of the chieftains who had supported him at the Grand Council negotiated quietly with Gora of the Western Valleys and arrived at new agreements that effectively isolated Curak politically. He was not gone from the world. Men like Curak were not removed from the world by legal processes. But he was constrained, publicly discredited, and most critically unable to touch the Gorehorn clan's water rights, grazing rights, or settlement rights without immediately triggering a cascade of accord penalties that would cost him more than the plateau territory was worth. It was not a perfect victory. It was a real one which was better. The afternoon the final court decision came through, Ezekiel was at the forge, working on a new set of wheel fittings for the clan's heaviest wagon, when Bagrak came up the hill road with the document in her hand. She came into the forge without knocking, the way she always did now, and she held out the document and he read it, and then he set it on the anvil edge and looked at her. She was trying to keep her face composed. She was not entirely succeeding. There was something in the set of her jaw and the brightness of her eyes that was not the calculated control of the Gorehorn Chieftess, managing a difficult situation. It was something rawer and more personal, the specific relief of a woman who has been carrying a clan's safety on her back for 3 seasons and has just felt the weight shift, not disappear but shift, to something manageable. He crossed to her and put his arms around her, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed. Just breathed. He held her and she held him, and neither of them said anything for a long time. Then she said, muffled by his shirt, "Your apprentice is staring at us through the window." He looked. Darrow was, in fact, watching from the bellows station with wide eyes, trying very hard to appear busy with something. "Darrow," Ezekiel called. Darrow jumped. "Sir." "Finish the wheel fittings and then you can take the rest of the afternoon." A pause. "Yes, sir." And then very quietly, what might have been a sound of satisfaction. Bagrak lifted her face from his shoulder and looked up at him, and her eyes were amber and warm and fully open, and she said, "I'm going to propose something." "What?" "A proper seat in the forge house, not just the stool by the window." She looked at him with the directness that was so specifically entirely her. "A real chair, my chair." Here, he understood what she meant. She was proposing, in the language they had built between them, a permanence, a full claiming of the space as hers too. Not just the camp, not just the clan, this place too. The forge, the hill, the view of the plateau, and the windmills turning gold in the afternoon light. "There's room for a proper chair," he said. "There's been room for a while." "I know," she said. "I was waiting to be asked." He pulled her close and kissed her forehead, and then the bridge of her nose, and then her mouth, and she kissed him back in the complete and unhurried way that she kissed everything, with her full, undivided attention, making it clear without words that there was nowhere else she intended to be. The windmills turned above the forge house in the late afternoon light, great slow circles against the pale plateau sky. The grain fields ran gold to every horizon. The camp fires at the east edge of the plateau were beginning to breathe up their evening smoke. Darrow had set the wheel fittings aside and gone, and the forge was quiet except for the comfortable pop of the banked fire. Ezekiel Prescott stood in the doorway of his father's forge, which was now his forge, which was now, in all the ways that mattered, their forge, with Bagrak Gorehorn's hand in his and the blood price gone, and the court ruling settled and the plateau water rights secured, and the autumn sun turning everything to copper and gold. And he felt, for the first time in years, maybe for the first time ever, not like a man standing at the edge of his life, looking in. He felt like a man in the middle of it. Bagrak stood beside him, looking out at the plateau with the measuring attention she gave to every territory she claimed. Then she glanced at him sideways, and there it was, the full smile, the one she gave only to him, the one that had taken weeks to build and was now simply part of how she looked when she was with him, open and certain and fierce and warm all at once. "The hinges on the camp storage chest still need replacing," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "The Talbot watershare agreement needs a final signature. Tomorrow. And Droga wants to discuss the North Pasture expansion." "Tomorrow," he said firmly, and she laughed, that low, surprised sound that he had loved from the first time he heard it, and leaned against him, and the windmills turned, and the plateau was wide and golden and theirs. Neither of them had ever been here before, in this exact country of being fully chosen, fully known, fully present to another person's life. It was new ground for both of them, and it was rough in places, and it would require the same steady work that every worthwhile thing required. But they had both, separately, spent too many years on the practical details of survival to be afraid of work. They were craftspeople in their different ways, she of clan and territory and the long, patient labor of keeping a people safe. He of iron and fire and the precise knowledge of what a thing needs to be what it should be. The hard bargain that bought them a real future was not a single dramatic moment. It was the court decision and the water rights and the Grand Council vote and the Forge Alliance and the autumn document on the anvil edge and the chair that would be put by the fire tomorrow. It was the accumulation of honest work and honest words and the willingness to stand in whatever circle needed standing in without flinching. They had walked through it together, and they were here. Bagrak Gorehorn, Chieftess of the Gorehorn Clan, had looked at the soot-armed blacksmith on the hill at the beginning of all of it and decided he was worth the risk. She had not been wrong, and Ezekiel Prescott, who had spent 6 years being the last person anyone thought to look for, had been seen. Fully, clearly, without reservation, by a woman who feared nothing and could have chosen anyone and had chosen him. The windmills turned, the plateau breathed, the forge fire banked down to embers, patient and warm, waiting for morning.